During the national liberation struggle of 1917-1921, Ukraine was in a difficult situation which no European country had experienced in modern history. With the collapse of power and complete anarchy, the army of the young Ukrainian People's Republic was opposed by the military forces of the Bolsheviks, the White Guard, Poland, and the military political bloc of the Entente. Each of the fighting sides has its own aggressive plans about Ukraine. Poland wanted to regain Volyn and Galicia. Lieutenant General of the Imperial Russian Army Anton Denikin could not by any stretch of the imagination see Ukraine existing outside of borders of the Russian Empire. In Russian historical propaganda, Kiev and Ukraine were assigned the role of the main sources of the Russian state. And accordingly, the Russians simply could not imagine how Ukraine could be separate from Russia. Russia could not exist without Ukraine because this notion was driven into people's minds in schools, universities, and history courses, and people were firmly convinced of this fact of life. They had no alternative as residents of the Russian Empire, and Bolshevik Russia had its own reasons. It did not want to lose a powerful industrial region with its boundless fields of grain. The beginning of the 20th century was the age of coal and metal. Accordingly, the Donetsk-Kryvyi Rih Basin was the most powerful industrial region of the Russian Empire, although some part belonged to foreign companies, but nevertheless. The fact was that who controlled the coal mining and iron ore industries can control Russia. If not all of it, then certainly a great part of it. When the basin was cut off from Moscow, from Petrograd, these two Russian capitals were simply asphyxiated, as there was not enough produced to feed their people. A prolonged war on several fronts exhausted Ukraine and its population, which mainly consisted of peasants. At that time, the whole Ukrainian nation was a peasant nation. There was even a joke floating around that you could put the Ukrainian elite in one rail car, and if at some point the train crashed, Ukrainians would have remained without leaders. And indeed, the entire Ukrainian movement was first and foremost a movement of the peasant class. The village was promised a lot and eventually abandoned to the mercy of fate. Everybody demanded grain and food from Ukrainian peasants. They watched as one government changed the other and mentally cursed all politicians with all their governments. The peasants, in the first place, were worried about how to get land and quietly manage it. For this, they were only to support any power. In search of another ally, the peasants rebelled against the authorities and went over to the side of the enemy. The peasants did not know how to arrange a new life, but they most certainly did not want to return to the old, unjust, exploitative regime. When the peasants during the year 1917-1918 and even more in 1919 years experienced a certain process of changes in political authorities and political regimes, they saw their ineffectiveness, and that none of them could resolve the critically important land issue for the agrarian sector. They did not propose any adequate formula, so in response the peasants took a very cotton Poltava peasant position. My hut is right here. This is my farm, I will fight for it. A little further, the province, the peasant went for them with great reluctance. But the offensive of the authorities against the peasantry forced the latter to leave their homelands and join large military groups. There was a need for such a long period of political and armed struggle to tear peasants away from their small estates and force them to go anywhere. This was already a direct threat. It was the direct terror of either the Bolsheviks or the Whites, so that the peasants could leave and gather somewhere in Kholodny Yar or in the region of Gulay-Polya. One of the main features of the peasant rebel movement in Ukraine of those times was its mass character and scale of its revolutionary spontaneity. The scale was colossal. Researchers say that from the period of 1917-1918 up to the Great Famine, there was a kind of a peasant war in Ukraine. It was a war of everybody against everyone else. Indeed, the entire Ukrainian population took part in this war. The gubernatorial regions of Kiev, Kherson, Yekaterinoslav, Podolsky, Volyn, Poltava, Chernihiv, and northern Tavria were captured by the rebel movement. Each of the insurgent detachments was independent, held on the authority of the ataman, and was guided by its strategy in choosing allies.
це залежало від кожної конкретної ситуації.
It depended on each specific situation. There was no single general line, such as we cooperate with the Ukrainian army. There were times when individual detachments went to support the Bolsheviks. There were times when these insurgents turned to the whites when they supported the army of the UPR. But in most cases, the main objective behind this was to protect one's own land. And one's own land meant here in the village. And at some point, they went as far as denial of any power of any army. Whoever would come, they all had to be driven out.
Вже до заперечення будь-якої влади і будь-якої армії. Хто би не прийшов, всіх треба вигнати.
A striking example is the activity of the Ukrainian ataman Zeleny, whose real name was Danilo Terpilo. His detachment of insurgents numbered about 4,000 peasants and operated in the region of Tripilya in the Kiev Oblast. Ataman Zeleny, with the Cossacks, fought against Hetman Skoropadsky on the side of the Directory of the Ukrainian People's Republic, then against the Directory of the UPR on the side of the Bolsheviks. Later, they fought against the Bolsheviks along with the Directory. And in the end, they fought against the White Guard. In one of the battles near Kharkiv, the brave Ataman died, and his detachment disintegrated because it held only onto the authority of the Ataman. The mass insurgent revolutionary movement of the Ukrainian peasantry took on various forms, from small, spontaneously created armed detachments to large territorial formations which were called Cossack states. One such was the self-proclaimed Holodny Yar Republic, which existed in 1919-1922 on the lands of the present Cherkasy Oblast in the area of the forest tract Holodny Yar. It fought against the Bolsheviks longer than any of the other forces among the insurgent detachments.
Холодний Яр – це така територія, вперше вона освячена історією, так, ми знаємо, що історія.
We cannot say that the history of Holodny Yar began in 1918 or 1919. It stretches from the Cossacks' lands. Such was the vast territory of Holodny Yar. First of all, it was sanctified by history. We know that history sanctifies just like toil on the land. Secondly, the territory is difficult to control and it's very difficult to get there. This is a deep forest. It is far from any civilized cities or villages. Holodny Yar was often perceived as a free territory, where you can go and do what you think is necessary, when you can work peacefully. Of course, when attempts of repression began and attempts were made to force something that was not meant to be, people began coming here in droves.
Люди почали стікатися сюди.
The self-proclaimed Holodny Yar Republic covered more than 25 nearby villages and had a 15,000-strong armed peasant Cossack rebel army.
Мешканці цих сіл змогли зорганізувати певний...
People of surrounding villages were able to organize a certain ideal of such an anarchistic, perhaps freedom-loving territory. It cannot be called a republic, nor can it be called a state. It was a way of self-organization of society. This is the civil society which we're all trying to build today. This way of existence of society was credible, and rumors about this spread quickly to all surrounding villages. People began to go there to observe and find out how it is there, what is there. Or there were those who did not have a place in their home village. Some were persecuted while others were simply driven out. Of course, they went to where it was more comfortable. It was the heart of Ukraine, the heart of the Ukrainian peasantry. The enemies were even afraid to approach Holodny Yar. The slogan of the insurgents written on their flag resounded decisively, "Freedom to Ukraine or death." But the largest insurgent group of those times in Ukraine was the so-called Army of Nestor Makhno. It had more than 50,000 soldiers and operated in the southeast of Ukraine. Makhno wanted to create an independent peasant republic based on self-government and to establish people's power, to eliminate exploitation of the peasantry and give land for free to those who cultivate it. In order to achieve this goal, Makhno formed alliances both with the Bolsheviks and with the White Guard. Researchers have no single view on the role of Nestor Makhno in Ukrainian history. Some consider his role to be destructive and view him outside the Ukrainian revolutionary movement as a follower of the ideas of Russian anarchists. Others believe that if the masses followed this movement, there must have been something in this program and actions that deeply touched the inner soul of the Ukrainian peasant.
Доволі часто можна почути, що Махно, мовляв, це не зовсім український рух, це якийсь там анархістський рух, ще якийсь. Справді, це анархісти, це такі нормальні, звичайні.
Quite often you can hear that Makhno was not exactly a Ukrainian movement. This was an anarchist movement or something like that. Indeed, these were anarchists. These were normal, ordinary anarchists. And when Makhno and his detachment tried to make a trip to the east, to Russian ethnic territories while they were marching through Ukrainian villages, they had gained support. They had a place to spend the night and were provided water and food for the horses. They were not worried about global problems, but the moment they entered the Russian villages, such support disappeared and Makhno turned back from this territory. Makhno returned to Ukraine, and was he not Ukrainian? He had this influence, his value. At least with his existence, he showed that there is such a certain peasant element that is not so easy to curb. Neither the totalitarian Soviet regime, nor the democratic Ukrainian one, nor the White Guards could conquer it. No one could force the Ukrainian peasant to do just anything.
Ніхто так просто не може змусити селянина, українського селянина до чогось.
Finally, Bolshevik Russia occupied Ukraine in November 1920, but the resistance of the Ukrainian insurgents continued until the famine of 1921-1923, which was organized by the Soviet government. Almost until the famine, the communists did not control the Ukrainian villages. Every now and then there are revolts and riots. For a very long time, the communists were afraid to go to the villages. They controlled the railway station in the country center, but outside the country center, they went only with an entourage of security guards, because they were afraid that they might be killed and robbed there. The Ukrainian peasants were not so easy to curb. It was not so easy to convince them by promises.
Так просто його в чомусь переконати, не обіцявши щось.
To fight the insurgency in Ukraine, the Bolshevik government engaged numerous detachments of security officers and police units. They did not disdain any methods. They sent agents and dummies, created false rebel detachments, and those who joined them were arrested. They announced false mobilization on behalf of the Ottomans, and then all the volunteers were repressed. They took hostages in villages and demanded the extradition of Ottomans, and so on. As a result of the Red Terror, the military operations in 1922, all rebel cells and centers were liquidated, and most of their leaders were killed in battle or shot after being arrested. The Bolsheviks finally overcame the peasant resistance with the help of the famine of 1921-1923. Of course, it was orchestrated for objective reasons: drought, poor harvest, and ruination. But the Soviet authorities did their best to organize it and did nothing to help the Ukrainian peasants survive.
При нормальному економічному житті, напевно, вдалося б уникнути.
In the event there was a normal economic life, it would be quite possible to avoid hunger or famine. Still, there was a factor of nature. The drought was in 1921. Also, the economic disruption of every 10 years of the war and the fact that there were no normal economic boundaries were additional factors. But if there were such links, the prices of food would rise. But it would be all right. It would mean a flow of food productions to somehow it could be adjusted. But the Bolsheviks, due to their policy, they might introduce SNAP, they will do something, but this did not give normal result. As a result, we were left with a huge number of victims, which are still being counted, 1.5 to 2 million as far as I know. In historical works and republications of the Soviet era, the insurgency in Ukraine was hushed up. The authorities were afraid to speak frankly about this because they believed that this would incite undesirable moods in society. Therefore, the rebel movement was interpreted as banditry, and the participants of this movement allegedly did not have any ideological, social, or political motives. The further course of historical events showed that the rebel peasant movement of 1918-1922 in Ukraine was only the first powerful wave. Peasant riots and protests broke out with a renewed vigor in the late 1920s and early 1930s in connection with forced collectivization. Their scale has reached such proportions that even the existence of Soviet power in Ukraine in general has been put into question.